Are you engaged in a suffering contest? This week, I'm talking with Gary Simonds, a retired neurosurgeon, about the high pressure, high intensity environments he faced throughout his medical training and career. His use of the term suffering contest was such an appropriate way to describe the experience so many of us have in our workplaces today. While his experience is unique to the medical field, many of us operate in environments that promote and reward hustle culture, which undermines our mental and physical health. We also explore practices that can train our brains to focus more on the positive and empower us to feel less like a victim. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Gary. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and I'd love to start by asking you to introduce yourself.
Well, hi, I'm Gary Simonds, and thank you so very much for having me. I am honored and really look forward to this. I am by training a neurosurgeon, and I practiced neurosurgery for decades and created and ran a neurosurgery department at Virginia Tech and the Carilion Clinic in Roanoke, Virginia. And dealt with a lot of corporate concerns and personnel matters for many years, and became very interested in the world of burnout and trying to build resilience in my team, and then beyond that in other healthcare workers particularly. I retired from neurosurgery, from actually doing surgery 3 years ago, and have continued to teach at Virginia Tech, both undergrads and medical students. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now.
Thank you. And we always joke about it's not brain surgery, but it is for you.
It certainly has been. I guess we remind ourselves that it's not particle physics.
Well, how was that experience? Because I can imagine that it was a very competitive environment. There's a lot on the line. You must have felt a lot of pressure during surgery, especially perhaps earlier in your career. How did you think about handling your own self-doubt? Did you feel like there were times when you questioned whether you had what it took to do your job? Like what was it like for you as you were developing into the neurosurgeon that you would later become and retire?
Well, it's a long, grueling process. So one way that they work it out is you just spend a lot of hours immersed in that world, and hopefully in a well thought out situation, they bring you up slowly and gradually. It's not like the first day they throw you into the middle of an aneurysm and say, all right, have at it, buddy, figure it out. So you kind of start small and you work your way up to the bigger and more challenging things. But obviously it's staggering if you stop and think. And I think we were so busy that at times you weren't stopping and thinking much. You were just doing. It was that kind of total immersion type of approach. But when you would stop and think and you would say, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. It could literally stop you in your steps. I think where it really hit was after getting out of training. So the training is at least 7 years after medical school. And you spent, I mean, in those days, we spent 110 or so hours a week in the hospital. We were up every night, every third night, and you just work on through the next day. So as I say, I mean, I am talking total immersion and not a lot of time to stop and think. But there's also a lot around you. There's a lot of superstructure around you. When you get out and you start practicing yourself, you kind of look around and you go, oh my God, this is now all on my shoulders. There's no real backup at this point. And I think that's when it really hits.
Wow. I can imagine that transition being a tough one, but I love what you're describing. And I wonder if there are fundamental principles that we could translate to other environments. The bringing you slowly and gradually through the experience, the superstructure, it seems like there was already an expectation that this was going to perhaps be triggering for people, that they, and because of the high stakes of what you're doing, that there was a framework kind of built around it to minimize the chances that you would make mistakes or second guess yourself. And so one of the things that I notice in more, corporate types of environments is a lot of times it is sink or swim. It's not an aneurysm, but it's kind of a, okay, you just got promoted. Here you go, figure it out, right? And I know you've worked on the more administrative side of things too. Like, do you feel like there are things that we could learn from the training that you went through that might prepare professionals a little bit better?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? I think there's never a perfect mechanism, never a perfect system. And there are pluses and minuses to various ways that we address things. I mean, when I was just talking about our training years, certainly the surgical side was very graded. And I think when you're dealing with something very high stakes, very technical, very high stakes, that makes a lot of sense to make sure that you go in a graded fashion, that there is a comfort level at each level. And I think we're fairly good at that. What though at the same time was done was outside of the operating room, we were kind of thrown into the deep end. Your first day, first night of call, you're getting called all over the hospital for one problem or another. And at least back in that era, it was a sign of weakness, if you will, if you were calling for help from anybody else. So you just went and handled all the problems that were being brought your way, which were a lot, as best you could. It may not have been the best practice of medicine, but there was a plus to it because you matured super fast. Your judgment, your sixth sense of what was going on around you, of who was looking really sick and who was probably going to do okay until the morning, all developed super fast. And I think, it certainly helped if you were conscientious, and again, the stakes there were pretty high as well. They weren't as obvious, not as direct as operating on a brain, but I mean, these were sick people in all corners of the hospital that you were being called to see. So I think that scenario wasn't so bad either, at least on the training side of things. It would have been probably much better and much more comforting and better for the psyche to feel backed up, that if you really felt like you were getting in deep, to have backup, which there was, but there was kind of a macho culture back in those days. And that's something that we've tried to get out of the system. We worked real hard to make it a plus to call for help rather than a negative. You never should feel guilty. You never should feel emasculated, if you will, if you send up a flare. If you really are feeling out of your depth and you're worried about hurting somebody, you by all means should be calling for assistance, and it should be a sign of real maturity and growth that you feel capable of doing that. And I think that has improved since my days back, again, when it was a check mark against you if you ever sought out help.
I'm really glad to hear that that's changing, because that's one of the areas that can be so triggering for so many of us. Is I have a need, but I can't, or I have a question, or I need support externally, but it's not safe to ask for that. And so it's great to hear that there are deliberate efforts being made to change that. But I think that's probably something that takes time too, because part of it is just the human ego.
Yes.
And speaking of the human ego, how were the interactions that you had with your fellow trainees? Was it a super competitive environment? How did you handle the pressure of just feeling like you're constantly competing with each other?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm going to step back for 1 second, though, about your comment about the ego. There's an interesting phenomena in my world, which does seem to be improving, and we certainly are trying to make it improve, that is very ego intensive. And from talking to people in other industries, I believe it's there too. And that is that we almost saw our world as a suffering contest, where I can out-suffer you. I can be up more hours, through the night. I see more patients. I can take on the harder stuff. And it was almost like it wasn't a contest for excellence. It was a contest for who can suffer the most. This twisted machoism that had gotten in there, and I think I hear it more and more in other industries as well. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that translates. It's obviously different context, but I think that translates into a lot of what we consider to be hustle culture.
Yes.
Right. It's that who can work the longest hours. It's a badge of honor to say, I was here until 2 a.m. and then I was back in the office again at 6, and I haven't slept at all. And I had, and that people are trying to one up each other through the amount of overwork they're doing.
Exactly. And obviously this is going to be very toxic. We shouldn't be out suffering each other. We should be out humanitying each other or something.
Yeah.
But you had asked about, the competition between residents, and that was one of the better things about my world, at least about what we went through. The residents were very tight. Closest friends in my life, the people I still stay super in touch with and are always communicating with, are my fellow residents. And I think in that world, however that structure was, there was a kind of foxhole mentality that these were your foxhole buddies, and you'd throw yourself on a grenade for them. And, so again, there is some plus to that. But then if you take that too far, then it becomes a tribalism where only we are part of that tribe, and everybody else in the hospital is the enemy. Mm-hmm. And even other residents from other specialties and other doctors from other specialties, they're lesser beings because they're not part of the tribe. So that's a little dangerous. But I would say the main competitor you had was with yourself. And that, again, gets back into the imposter syndrome where, you're constantly telling yourself you're not good enough. You better be doing better. You handled something imperfectly. Why aren't you doing everything perfectly? And that competition was really rough. And the competition with yourself was pretty nasty and no holds barred.
Is that so? The only frame of reference I have for the culture of the medical profession is what we see on TV, right? And a lot of that is, almost hazing rituals and, brutal, breaking people down and building them back up again. And I wonder, when you talk about some of the effects of asking for help or feeling like it's a sign of weakness, how much of that came from the rewards and punishments that were baked into the system? Do you feel like you were being told from your superiors that you were not good enough, or was this coming from within?
Definitely some of both. I think, and again, I mean, there's always two sides to these things. You want people who are willing to push themselves and extend themselves and expect excellence out of themselves. You don't want people who expect to be perfect. There's real danger in perfection because we know we're not going to reach it. And then what are you going to do when you don't? Are you going to fall down? Are you going to fabricate? All that is a possibility. But there was definitely some pressure from above. I mean, we would do a lot of what they call rounding, where you, as a group, you're seeing patients and discussing them, and you were expected to know your stuff, and you were expected to know everything about the patients. And there were definitely high expectations put on you. And running my own training program through the years, I certainly instilled that as well. This does take a huge amount of commitment and a huge amount of work, but hopefully we were able to establish is the fact that we don't expect you to be perfect, and we don't expect you to know everything right out of the blocks. So, for example, if you were on these rounds and you're discussing a patient, my practice would be to ask the junior most resident, what we call the PGY1, the postgrad one, the opening salvo of questions. And when they ran out of answers, you wouldn't castigate them. You wouldn't toss them out of the program. You would then turn to the next person in line, the PGY2, and say, well, what do you think? And then go up to the PGY3 when they ran out, and so forth. And, by the time you got to the PGY7s, you were expecting a different, more mature view of things, more nuanced. And so it is, you're walking that fine. I certainly used a lot of drama. Woe unto me that you don't know this disease. But eventually it was their responsibility to know it, my responsibility for them to know it. I had to sign off and say that they were safe to release onto the unsuspecting public. But if you put all that weight on the first year, we would just crush them. There's no way they could know, 3/4 of the stuff we were throwing out. So we never tried to shame the first year unless it was something a first year absolutely should know. And even there, not shame is the wrong word, but, say, hey, you need to look that up. That is something I expect you to know. And maybe some of that is a transparency. These are the things you must know from one stage to another. And that was clearly mapped out for them. To go back to the TV shows, my wife and I often watch these detective, murder mystery shows where they go through the detective process. And we quite enjoy them. I think particularly the British ones. But I'm sure that if a real detective was watching them, they would be going, "Oh my God, this is so far off. This is ridiculous." And I'm afraid that's kind of me in a medical show. It's almost impossible to watch. So that may not be your best source.
Well, that's good to know. I'm curious if you have seen, probably more so in recent history, more of a focus on psychological safety. I know that concept started in healthcare. Is that something that you thought a lot about as you were thinking about your own training program?
Absolutely. To one degree or another, that was always a concern of mine. Some people nicknamed me the Che Guevara of residents, I guess, because I was always arguing for the residents, psychological safety. But I think it really came to a head, and this is how I got into this business. It came to a head with my entire team many years ago, really long before it became in vogue. But it just seemed like my team was getting in trouble all over the hospital. The residents, the faculty, our PAs, just the whole team was getting in trouble for being snappy, being short, condescending, angry. And it kind of reached a toxic level. And believe me, I'm sure I was one of them. I don't want to make it sound like it was everybody else and not me. But it reached kind of a toxic level. And I started looking into whether this could be burnout. I had started reading about burnout and happened to run into a world expert on physician burnout. And we started working on the team together for years. And I ended up writing 3 books on it. And so when that fuse really got lit, it kind of stepped up multiple notches. So I had always been concerned, but maybe that I felt like all of a sudden I had more tools to go at it with. And we really dove into the psychological health of our entire team, frankly, not just the residents, because again, all of us, I think we're all setups in the modern world. We're all it doesn't just have to be in healthcare. I think everyone is multitask to the nth degree. We're in these suffering contests we talked about. We're all expected to extend ourselves above and beyond. We're all taking work home. It's a hyper complex world, and I think it has a way of emptying all of us. And once we're emptied of our energy to deal with these things, then I think our idiosyncrasies start to surface, and we just start making life harder on ourselves and harder on each other, which I think then adds to the misery of everybody else around us. So I think it all reverberates, and if the more we can kind of take care of ourselves as well as those around us, I think the smoother sailing we would have.
I'm glad you brought up the burnout piece too, because it sounds like a recipe for burnout, what you're describing sort of environmentally as well as within our own minds. And it's scary to think of putting your fate in the hands of a doctor who's burnt out. There's certain things that you want your doctor to be taking care of themselves and being well rested and focused. And so, what are the remedies or the tools that you use to minimize or address burnout?
Yeah, we have lots. The one thing I would say though is, commenting on your comment, it's scary if the person putting together our food is burned out. It's scary if the bus driver is burned out, or your airline pilot, or you can go all the way if the barista is burned out. I don't know what's going in my coffee. And so I think I think it's a bad state for any of us. And again, there's a ripples in a pond effect on all levels. It's certainly poison to our relationships as well. So yeah, we have a whole series of things that we recommend in the books. And one of the we kind of used my team as a test case for a few years there of cycling in different techniques and different concepts. And one of the things that we found that I think is really important to remember is that what works for Peter doesn't work for Paul. So, if you, and I think this is one of the dangers right now as corporations. I mean, certainly the medical world is recognizing it. They're mandating it in the training programs to have some sort of wellness program. And, some of the programs are doing it very cynically. We have bring in a few puppies, every 6 months, and you get to pet the puppies. And we say, oh, we've done our wellness training. And others take it very seriously. But they may be trying these one size fits all. Okay, everybody's going to learn mindfulness. We're all going to sit in our chairs and be mindful of the air around us. And we're going to feel the air rushing across our nostrils and really focus in on that. Well, you try that on me, and within 3 seconds, I'm like, oh, this is bull, man. Just get me out of here. So one of the big lessons really to us is the idea that, you have to kind of find what helps you. Now, ideally, yes, your corporation, your industry, it is looking for ways across the board to make the work more humane, less multitask, less driven every second of the day for perfection, all that sort of thing. But we really focused on what the individuals could and should do. So I'm not going to go through a list of 70 or so ideas, but our ideas are relatively simple and straightforward up front. Because if we make them complex, our feeling is that people will just ignore them and never even try. But a couple of things, a couple of the real ground rules. The first one is what we call self-compassion, and that is to really get to know yourself, to actually grant yourself time to think about, who am I, what drives me, what am I trying to accomplish, what brings me reward, what makes me feel energized and engaged, what is stressing us out. And of course, that's real easy to figure out, what's stressing us out. But really, and write some of these things down and think about them so that you know what you need to focus on, what you need to address. As I said, some people, no two people are going to respond the same way. So some people, like in my business, I love being in a melee. That's what fueled me, was if all hell was breaking loose all the time, it must be some sort of adrenaline rush or something. But I would start feeling out of it when there weren't emergencies coming in, when the trauma alerts weren't going off. Other people would stress out with that. So we're different people, and we're going to respond differently to the different stimuli around us. And nobody's going to do it for you. Nobody's going to figure this out and then fix you. So, to really get to know yourself and know what are the drivers and what are the things that drag you down, I think is a big one. And then the corollary to that is, if you figure it out, you've got to attend to it. You can't then just ignore it and say, oh, no, yeah, well, okay, I realize that this is the type of thing that really gets to me. It's, okay, what am I going to do about it? Is there a way I can modify it in such a way that it's going to be less stressful? Is there more opportunity to get into the things that are energizing me and making me feel better, and to strategize about that? And then we affix to both those, self-compassion and self-care, we affix no guilt. You can't feel guilty for taking care of yourself, precisely for what you were talking about earlier. And that is, you don't want the people caring for you or the people driving your bus or flying your plane burned out. You want them happy and energized and thrilled to be there. So you've got to be able to do this with no guilt, because ultimately it's better for your customers, if you will, if you want to call them customers. I'll just give you another example of one other thing, one of the many suggestions that we say for people to try. But one is what we call harvesting uplifts. And that is in our day, certainly in the medical world, but I think this again goes across industries. We train our brains to look for bad things. In the medical world, or in my surgical world, if somebody's come out of surgery and they're doing great, we don't sit there and high five and run around the hospital whooping and yelling. What we do is we go, all right, when's the boot going to drop? What's going to go wrong? What could go wrong? We literally train ourselves to anticipate the worst, because that way we ostensibly can head it off. But we've trained our brains, therefore, constantly to be looking for bad things. And what we suggest, one strategy to try, is to tell yourself, maybe for 2 straight weeks, every day when you go into work, I want you to write down 5 things that happened that were good, were on the positive side. Somebody smiled at you, somebody thanked you, you heard a great song that brought back great memories of your past on the radio driving in. Who knows? Just write down 5 really good things that happened during the day that made you feel better. And maybe take a look at them before you go to sleep at night and just say, a few things happened today that were pretty good. But if you do that for a week or two, it's been shown that you literally train your brain to seek these things out. And after a while, you don't have to tell yourself. Your brain just starts noticing it amongst the hard stuff. You start noticing, oh, well, this project we were working on really worked out. That's great. And the world becomes a little bit more positive for you.
I so appreciate that. And I love hearing your perspective on it too. I have a similar strategy that I recommend from a confidence perspective, because we are so quick to judge ourselves for what we don't know and the mistakes that we make, and we breeze right past all of the good things that we're doing. So I often encourage people to write down what you're doing well as a way of training your brain to see the positive. And so I think that's a very practical step that people can take. And I love your guidance around writing down your stressors as well. That framework of self-compassion and self-care with no guilt is such an important one. And I think that's something that everybody should take to heart, because we sort of feel sometimes like we're hostages in a system that doesn't support us. But at the end of the day, we need to take our own power back and take responsibility for our own experience. And if we're winning the suffering contest and nobody knows that, right, then we're not seeking out the support from ourselves or from others that can help us to get through that. I'm curious, just as sort of a final question here. There's a lot, and I say this with a bias because this is very fascinating to me personally too, but there's a lot of talk these days about neuroscience and, sort of how to think about the way the brain works in motivating people and in just sort of understanding some of the challenges that we experience in the workplace. Do you think that that's a good thing? Are there risks in sort of all of us being amateur neuroscientists out in the world? Do you have thoughts on how we can bring more of the positive understanding of the brain into some of the challenges that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you asked that question. And I mean, it opens a huge amount of doors. But I think it is a really important thing to understand. First of all, we're all amateur neuroscientists, period. Even the most neuroscientists of them all are amateurs, right? Because we are just scratching the surface on how it all works. I always like to talk about how the fact that we don't even actually know how many nerve cells we have in the brain, but it's somewhere in the 80 to 140, I don't know, billion nerve cells, and each one has hundreds to thousands of connections with other nerve cells. So across our brain, they use the term quadrillions. I don't even know what that means anymore. Connections going on in our brains. So it's so complex that you do have to be careful when somebody says, "Oh, we've been doing functional MRIs on people, and we learned that if you drink green tea, you're going to get smarter every day." That sort of neuroscience is a little iffy. But the complexity of it is certainly well understood. And I think the key one for what you're asking about, and I think it is really both neat and amazing, and also I don't know, illustrative of the good that can come out of things, is that the brain is far more, we use the term plastic, there's more plasticity to it than any of us can imagine. So I think a lot of people kind of see our brains as like a computer, that there's a bunch of wires all connected up, and those wires communicate with one another, and somehow out of that we get Netflix, and we get what used to be called Twitter and all that. These computers do amazing things, but it's all just a bunch of wires put together in the factory. And frankly, when that's not enough, when you need the next level of complexity, you have to go buy a new computer because that wiring is fixed. That's the way it's going to be. And I think a lot of us see our brains as being the same way. We come out of the factory, and this is how we're wired. The genes set us up the way we are, and that's the way we're going to be. And the reality is, the brain is not like that at all. That it is, we said there are quadrillions of connections. Those connections are changing all the time. We're making new connections. We're taking other connections away. We're strengthening connections. It gets way down to the micro level of how much chemical do we release at each connection, what we call the neurotransmitters, the dopamines and stuff like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine, all that stuff. How much do you even release? How many receptors are there for those chemicals when you're trying to communicate from one nerve cell to another? Is changing all the time. We even change the way our genes are read. The genes are there, but how often you read them, how often you print out new proteins from them is constantly in flux. And all of this is influenced by what we're doing, what we're thinking, what we're experiencing day to day. So certainly we know that a lot of stress and a lot of trauma can change our brains dynamically and significantly, taking away a lot of important connections and stuff. But we also know really feeding our brains with challenging things, intellectual things, fun things, happiness, joy, engagement, all that sort of thing will strengthen kind of more positive sides of our brains, just like I was talking about with the harvesting of uplifts. And this is literally changing our brains on multiple levels, all the way down to the genetic expression, all the way down to how many chemicals are being released between two cells. That's always in flux and always influenced by our world. So when you get to trying to help people with various states of distress, there is a real ability to retrain our brains. It may take a lot of work. in brains that have been subjected to a lot of difficulties. And again, what works for Peter isn't going to work for Paul because none of our two brains are exactly the same. And so I think we have to find what helps strengthen the more positive aspects of our brains and go with that and recognize that we are changing ourselves and potentially, improving our lots for the future. So I think it's really neat and exciting, and I agree with you. I mean, if you want to get down to the neuroscience of it, it really bears fruit to take these approaches.
I love the optimism in what you're sharing, and it just reminds me, it sort of makes me think about the physiological side of the growth mindset, right? This idea that we're not fixed and that even if our brains have had some traumatic experiences, there is still opportunity and hope to keep moving in a positive direction. So and all the more reason to do some of the work that we're talking about too, in terms of managing our stress and understanding where we get relief from stress and targeting more of the positives in our lives. I think that's a really great place for us to wrap up today. Any final thoughts that you want to share?
Well, yeah, I'll give you one more that I think, dovetails exactly with what you said. And as you noted earlier, our work situations, our life situations doesn't always have to be at work. They may not be perfect. They may be very much heaping on more stress and more strain onto us. And so we can often feel very passive in this, and very much a victim of it. And obviously, if you're talking imposter syndrome, that's going to add very much to it because you're going to feel like you have no impact. So what am I doing here? I'm just kind of pretending. But one of the things that we go with, and it's very Pollyanna-ish, and we do a lot of Pollyanna stuff because of what we're talking about. But we say, okay, let's grant that 95% of all your stressors there at work are external. They're due to the system. They're due to the manager. They're due to this. They're due to that. Let's say 95%. What 5% might you alter for the better, for the positive? Is there anything that you can focus on and say, I am going to, push positive energy into this and see what comes out of it? And going along, all that we've said thus far is that just getting a sense that I can have some impact, that I can turn things into a better direction, even though I'm not steering the ship. This massive ocean liner is not going to turn because I'm paddling one way, but I may be able to affect a microenvironment around me. I may be able to make others around me happier. I may find a better way to get something accomplished. I may just buy myself more time, which would feel good, or I may feel more accomplished. But what could, instead of focusing on this place is killing me, everything is going wrong, focusing on something that we might be able to change for the better, I think has tremendous impact for a lot of people. And I always think too, when you're dealing with these massive superstructures, like, I worked for this massive healthcare system. There's still people involved at every level, and you may not be able to change things, but you'd be surprised, particularly if you come with positive change, how much impact that you can have, how much it can go up the ladder. And this, again, it's coming off very Pollyanna-y, and I realize that it's, often we are not going to make a huge dent, but it's worth it, even if it just puts you on a better footing on your day-to-day.
I couldn't agree with you more, Gary. I always like to take the optimistic, often Pollyanna view myself. And so I think that's really encouraging for people to feel more empowered than they might in this moment. So thank you so much for this conversation. If anybody's interested in learning more about you, where can they find you?
Thank you very much. And by the way, I love having these talks with people and hearing their strategies and what they're doing and what's succeeding for them and all. So I very much love to hear from other people. And I have my own website, which is just myname.com. So it's Gary R. Simonds. I pronounce it Simmons, but it's spelled Simonds, so SIMONDS .com. GaryRSimons.com, and you can easily find me and contact me through there.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Gary. I really appreciate your taking that time to have this conversation with me and for sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a great conversation.
Well, Kim, it's my delight, and thank you for letting me ramble on.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.